Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. I hope you can hear me up at the back. My name is Leslie Macara. I am the Assistant Principal for Community Relations in the university, and I'm also a Professor in the School of Law in the university too. And on behalf of all of my colleagues here, can I offer a very, very warm welcome to this lecture in our Changing World series. Now, as most of you will know here, this lecture series examines the many global challenges which we are facing as a society and the role of universities in meeting them. And in my view, never has such a series been so appropriate as now, in these somewhat turbulent and uncertain times. As H.G. Wells famously said, human history becomes more and more a race between education and catastrophe. And you should be well to remember that phrase, a race between education and catastrophe. Indeed, this lecture series accords very much with our own university's Enlightenment ideals that we still hold true to today. Scientific rigour, perfectibility of knowledge, dignity in human thinking. Ideals which we all want to aspire to and live up to today. Now, at this time, when expert knowledge has been somewhat reduced in populist narratives, i.e. experts have been given a real kicking in the popular press, it is far more important than now than ever before that we as scholars, and I say that as scholars, that's the university staff here, but also the students too, our scholarly community together, all of us should stand together and speak truth to power and put our research and teaching in the service of the wider community in our city, in our nation, across Europe, because we are a European university, and of course, the wider world. Turning more specifically now to this evening's occasion, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Professor David Reay. And I just want to say a little bit about David before I hand over the floor to him. He holds the chair of Carbon Management and Education, and he too is an assistant principal of Global Environment and Society. Dave has had a stellar career, a really stellar career, really one of those careers goes like that. He was educated at the universities of Liverpool and Essex. He joined the University of Edinburgh in 2001 to research emissions of the greenhouse gas nitrous oxide from agriculture. This was then followed by a project on carbon fluxes in forests before he became a National Environment Research Council Fellow, examining again greenhouse gas emissions from wetlands and agriculture. In 2008, Dave became the university's first lecturer in carbon management. He gained promotion to senior lecturer in 2009, reader in 2013, and acceded to his chair in 2014. A stellar career instead, and someone who is very much at the edge of knowledge. It's a real privilege to have him as a colleague in the university. Now, his recent publications include the books Nitrogen and Climate Change, Methane and Climate Change, and Your Planet Needs You, a kid's guide to going green. This is his contribution to children's literature. And all of these texts, in my view, should be mandatory reading for Donald Trump. They should be on his mandatory reading list now, especially the last one. So I told you this was a prescient lecture. Now, Dave is going to speak for around about 45 to 50 minutes, and then we will open up for questions and conversation thereafter. So, Dave, can I now invite you to give your lecture entitled Climate Smart Food? Ladies and gentlemen, Dave Reay.
Thank you, Leslie. And yeah, in terms of the topic of tonight's lecture, it's something that's really dear to my heart. So as Leslie was saying, I've worked at Edinburgh for many years now, and even before that, I worked a lot on agriculture and its interaction with climate, and it's something that I'm still working on, and hopefully I can give you tonight some of the essence of where the research is, but also some of the big challenges and solutions that we face in the coming decades. So as part of that, if this works, yeah, it's my own bit of slide. I love alliteration, and I wanted to kind of sum up the areas that I'm going to cover. So if we think about climate change and food, I think the key issues can be summed up by cause. In terms of food production, global agriculture is a major cause of climate change, a major source of greenhouse gas emissions. So we'll talk a little bit about that. It's also a potentially huge casualty in terms of the impacts of climate change through various impacts such as drought, heat, etc. But where I see food in the 21st century and climate smart food is in the potential for it to be a comrade which allows us to reduce our emissions in a way which also gives us food security, so is actually resilient to a future climate, so a win-win in terms of the food sector. So I really hope, it depends how the questions go later, but I really hope this lecture will be one where the positives outweigh the negatives in terms of the solutions that we have at our disposal and where we can go with these challenges. Okay, so first of all, in terms of some of the bad news, I guess, in terms of the causes. So on the right, I haven't got loads of figures in here, but I've got some. On the right, we've got a pie chart of all of our emissions. So global greenhouse gas emissions, the key driver of the climate change we're seeing. And you can see that big orange bit down at the bottom right. That's agriculture, forestry, and other land use. So it's up there with all of our energy use in terms of the source of greenhouse gas emissions. So you can see what an important source this is. And if we're going to address climate change, we can't forget this sector. It's got to be part of the solution. And in terms of where those emissions come from, well, Daisy the cow at the top there, she is a bit of a climate change machine. So she is responsible globally, and all ruminant livestock like her, for a huge amount of greenhouse gas emission through methane. So they belch a lot of methane. Not too much comes out the back end, despite what you may have been told. But they're a major driver in terms of emissions. They also are a big driver of nitrous oxide emissions. So I'm going to mention a bit about nitrogen because it's a real one of my favourite topics, but also really important for climate smart food. So the nitrogen story is with Daisy and with the second picture there, which is our nitrogen fertilisers. We put nitrogen fertilisers on our fields. We need to do that to grow the food that we need. But a result of that is nitrous oxide, this powerful greenhouse gas being emitted as well. And the other component, really important, certainly in the last 100 years or so, has been mass land use change for conversion of forests and natural ecosystems for agriculture, for the food we need. And if we think about where we've come from over the last 100, 150 years, and then we look at how many people we need to feed by the end of the century and our changing diets, agriculture poses a significant risk in terms of land use change and in terms of these emissions if we don't do something in terms of climate smart food production. So, in terms of Daisy and all of her friends that are the ruminants and what we can do about methane. What's methane smart food? Well, methane smart food really comes back very much to where the food's coming from. So if it's coming from, for instance, ruminants, one of the things we can do, we've got essentially a toolbox that's already being used to a certain extent around the world in different forms in terms of feed type. So we can increase the quality of the food for Daisy and all the other cows. That will tend to reduce the methane emissions per unit of milk or per kilogram of steak. We can add additives to cow feed. Now this is one of my, I have lots of areas in science really interest me. And one of my, I guess, almost problems is that I go off down tangents of research which are really interesting. And one of the really interesting areas for dairy research is a cow hotel in Australia where they are experts at measuring the methane from the cows. And apparently for cows, if you put lots of instrumentation on them, they emit a lot of methane because they're upset. So what you want to do is make your cows happy, and you want to give them an environment where they'll be natural in terms of their methane emissions. So they have this cow hotel, a research hotel in Australia, where they look at feed additives. What can you give to the cows which will keep them happy, keep them growing, but will reduce methane? And they've come up with some great additives. There's things like garlic. They found if you add garlic to the diet, then that can reduce the methane that's produced in their rumens. But there are issues about whether you can taste the garlic in the milk. You can add things like cinnamon, apparently works really well. These are all additives which have been explored in the research community in the hotel that can reduce methane, and obviously some of these have been used more widely. Antibiotics and vaccines are already used a lot in global livestock production. Again, they can reduce methane emissions in some circumstances, but there are wider issues in terms of using obviously antibiotics and vaccines in terms of resistance, and also their effectiveness can be quite limited for methane reduction. I guess the most important ones that progress has been made on and where there's real potential would be production efficiency. So how can you grow more food in terms of the form of meat or dairy in a more efficient way, a less resource intensive way, where you've got less wastage, you've got less emission of methane. The big one, I think, facing us in terms of methane emissions from livestock is probably the diet. If we look at global diet and we look at the trend that we followed in the UK, and many nations as their affluence increases have followed too, is an increase in meat consumption as we get richer. And that has a knock-on effect, depending on where the meats come from, in terms of those methane emissions. And that's something where, as we go forward into the next few decades, if we just follow a business-as-usual scenario of everyone in the world ending up with a diet like ours, which is fairly meat-intensive, then the emissions penalty we pay for that would be very high, even if we did use some of these interventions. So dietary choice I'm going to come back to. I don't know if you can make out these things, which look really tasty to me, even at this distance, but this would be an example of a dietary choice where you're still getting your protein, but instead of your lovely, and it is a lovely looking steak, you're getting your protein in that case from insects, which have a much lower carbon footprint in terms of methane emissions. Other areas where there's a huge amount of research going on in terms of climate smart food around reducing methane emissions. Rice agriculture, obviously a huge staple food source for many people in the world, and this is where some of the research has really gone from great research being applied quite widely. So one of the issues you get with rice agriculture is that a lot of it is rain-fed, and a lot of the rice is grown in flooded soils. And what you get in flooded soils is lots of methane production, because the microbes which produce methane, just like the ones in Daisy's gut, they like low oxygen conditions and lots of carbon, and they convert that into methane and emit it. And so globally, rice paddies are a major source of methane. So one of the things that's been done is research in terms of whether you can drain the rice paddies a bit more often, use things like managing the rice straw which comes off the paddies, and instead of putting that straight back on this soaked soil where the water is, you take it off-site and compost it. And the research showed that that could massively reduce methane in terms of draining the rice paddies at intervals in the growing season and using this rice straw. And that's actually been implemented widely across the world. It's cut emissions very substantially. The potential of this globally is about 4 million tonnes of methane less emitted per year through the drainage and the rice straw management. And it's a great success story already in terms of productivity actually going up. So it's been combined with a change in varieties that are grown, varieties that don't need to be flooded all the time. And so it's actually enabled farmers to increase their profits, increase their productivity, but reduce methane emissions simultaneously. Other things that have been worked on quite extensively include fertilisers. So you can add various fertilisers will reduce the methane emissions and increase the productivity. I mentioned varieties. Genetic modification is kind of part of that, and that's something in agriculture, obviously, that huge investment has gone into already, and it continues to go into it. And one of the most recent breakthroughs, it seemed, in terms of rice agriculture and genetic modification was a new rice variety which seemed to do the impossible. It seemed to be able to allocate much more of its resources, much more of its carbohydrate that it was producing to the rice, to the crop, and much less of it would go to the roots. And in this study, where they had used these transgenic techniques, it seemed to be able to give you greater yield and much less methane, because less of that carbon was going into the boggy soils and more of it into the rice. And so it was greeted by the scientific community, like these things always are, initially with, oh, that's really good. And then, as ever with academia, everyone went, but have you checked for things like, and these were the questions that were asked of the study, have you checked for the fact that if you're doing this and your carbon's going into the rice crop rather than the rice paddy into the soil, that, all right, short term you've got less methane, but are you depleting the carbon stock actually in your rice paddies? So over 10, 20 years of your study, maybe you've got a methane reduction benefit, but actually you've got huge carbon loss from the soil, and actually is it as good for climate as you think? Other questions were asked about things like increase in nitrogen fertilizer for this genetically modified rice variety. And that was the beauty, like Leslie says, about, I think, evidence-based policy and academia is that everything is contested, and you can come up with what looks like the best things since sliced bread. And the brilliant thing about academia is someone will say, well, it's not. Sliced bread's still the best. And in terms of these kind of areas of research, there's so much going on, there's so much pressure because we need to meet a growing population and growing food demand, but we still need to do it with the best evidence possible and to look at some of the kind of indirect effects which might be negative or positive, but really make sure we understand what we're doing if we're implementing something like a genetically modified rice variety. So, in terms of methane, that was a quick snapshot of some of the tools we've got, some of the tools we're using in terms of tackling climate change through food, having more climate smart food. Nitrogen, as I mentioned, for me is probably as important, if not more important, because it's such an integral part to our global food system. It's such a precious resource, but it's also, when it's in the wrong place at the wrong time, it's such a threat, not just to climate, but as we'll see, to many different ecosystems, to air quality, etc. So in terms of nitrogen and food, huge global nitrous oxide source. So nitrous oxide is a greenhouse gas 300 times more powerful on a mass basis than carbon dioxide. So if we emit a lot of it, it has this huge effect in terms of warming globally. And agriculture is the main source. And one of the main issues we've got is our use of nitrogen fertilizer that's been put on that field up at the top left there is really low. Our efficiency is low. So the farmer spends a lot of money on this stuff. He puts it on his crop, but only about 30%, if he's lucky, ends up in the crop where he wants it. A lot of it gets diverted by microorganisms in the soil. They use it instead of the plants, so they're kind of having this battle for the nitrogen. Nitrous oxide is emitted as a part of that process, that microbial process. Some of it leaches through the soil and gets into water and causes problems there that we'll have a look at in a minute. Some of it is emitted to the air and causes pollution downwind of the site and can cause eutrophication, so changes in biodiversity. So our N-use efficiency, our nitrogen use efficiency, is absolutely fundamental to climate smart food in the 21st century. If we can push that nitrogen use efficiency up, we can really make our food smart. I mentioned already the population and diet drivers of emissions from food, and they're absolutely key in terms of that 9 billion estimated mouths to feed by 2050, combined with this change in diet, which at the moment tends to be towards more resource intensive, more emissions intensive food. So if we kept everything else the same in terms of our poor nitrogen use efficiency, then we would have a real problem on our hands in terms of extra emissions. And all the efforts we might be making in fossil fuel replacement with renewables, we would offset a lot of those by increase from the agricultural sector. So it's got to be in there in terms of what we do. And then in terms of the inefficient use, I mentioned climate, human health, ecosystem threats. Let's have a look a bit more, I guess, at the nitrogen story and how it fits into that. So nitrogen, like I said, is so fundamental to global food production, and it always has been. So on the top left there, you can see quite a big pile of poo. It's quite a big pile of manure. And what that's up there to signify is that our ancestors, about 10,000 years ago, started managing this stuff. They didn't know it was nitrogen, but they knew that as they transferred more and more to a sedentary lifestyle, so started farming instead of being hunter-gatherers, they realized quite quickly that the soil, after a few years, didn't seem to give as much productivity, give as much yield. It seemed to be running out of something. And they also found that if they put manure back on the soil, either from the livestock or from themselves, that the crops started to grow better again. What they were doing was replenishing some of that nitrogen stock that they had depleted in the soil. So we started managing it 10,000 years ago. And we developed great techniques as a society to better manage nitrogen. So these things over on the left here at the bottom, these are root nodules from legumes, things like peas and beans. And they are magic, honestly, they are magic in that they take the nitrogen we're breathing in now. 78% of the air in here is nitrogen gas. But most plants, most of the world can't use it. It's inert stuff, it's hard to get hold of. These plants, the legumes, in their nodules, they're able to fix that reactive nitrogen, that unreactive nitrogen into a reactive form that they can use themselves. So these are microbes in the nodules, but the plants can use it too. And so our ancestors found that if they grew peas and beans, the next year the soil was much more productive. What they had done is supercharge it with extra nitrogen from the atmosphere. So using these legumes was a great way for them to manage nitrogen. And then on the right, this is kind of the progression of all the time human population was growing. There was more pressure in terms of productivity. We needed more food per hectare around the world. And so on the right is the biggest mountain of poo I've ever seen. So I don't know if you can make out, so at the bottom there are a couple of wheelbarrows, and then halfway up there are some dark figures. They're people. And this is a huge mountain of bird poo. So this is in South America, in Peru, and it's seabird poo. So in this area, this is going back into the late 19th century. And the birds there would go, seabirds, would go and fish in the very rich waters. They would come back and they would poo in this area. And because it's very low humidity, very low rainfall, and quite cold as well, these mountains built up over generations and generations of bird poo. And it was discovered that obviously these were brilliant for fertilizing the world's fields. They were a concentrated form of reactive nitrogen, a great source of fertilizer. And after they were discovered, they were exploited so that they disappeared in a few years. They were worth a fortune. They were exported all over the world, particularly to North America and Europe. They helped supercharge our fields, but they were unsustainable. They disappeared. And so humankind actually hit a key point, I guess, at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, where our populations were still growing, but we had this reactive nitrogen constraint. If we were going to grow more food to meet the demands that we had to somehow crack the magic code of these nodules. We couldn't rely on these mountains because they had all been used up. We couldn't just rely on manure because that just recycles what you've already got. And there was a scientist in Germany called Fritz Haber who cracked it. He was a chemist and he worked out how to take that unreactive nitrogen in the air and make it a reactive form. His story is an amazing one. Google him tonight. Have a glass of wine. Google Fritz Haber. He is responsible in terms of his invention for probably about half of us here tonight. Without his invention, our populations would have been constrained. Our use of reactive nitrogen to feed our fields has been fundamental. He won the Nobel Prize for his work, but he is also the father of chemical warfare. So he's a little bit on the balance of, whenever he met his maker, there was a lot on both sides to weigh up. A really interesting story that if anyone asks questions later, I can tell you a bit more. Amazing, amazing life. So we had this invention, and it prolonged the First World War for 2 years. It allowed Germany to extend the First World War. Then the technology, the Haber-Bosch process, once it was industrialized, allowed all of us as the richer nations to make use of the technology to produce reactive nitrogen to feed our fields and feed our people. That's all great, and if we think about it in that context, I mentioned that, so on the right we've got, I think my last graph, hopefully, might be one more, in terms of projected population, something like 9 billion people by the middle of the century. So having that invention, having reactive nitrogen and our control over it is wonderful. It takes a field like the top one and it can turn one into something like the bottom, something much more productive. So in terms of food production, nitrogen is fundamental, but is it climate smart? And at the moment, I'd say it's not. It has many drawbacks through its inefficiency, particularly through nitrous oxide emission, but also through its interactions. If we're using lots of reactive nitrogen on our fields, and we've got changes in climate like much heavier rainfall, much more intense precipitation, then we risk a lot of that nitrogen not being used by the crops, but ending up in our drainage streams, ending up in coastal waters, causing problems rather than solutions. I first saw this, again, I didn't know I was seeing it, but I first saw this in Billingham. So Billingham is a town in the northeast of England, and it's where all my close ancestors grew up. My grandparents, my parents lived there. And my granddad was called Frank. Now Frank was, he worked in the ICI factory in Billingham, which was Europe's nitrogen factory. It was the biggest one in Europe, and he, I guess, lived and breathed nitrogen, literally. So he would come home with sacks of free fertilizer, and he had this really productive garden. So I remember things like his cabbages and vegetables in the garden. They grew so well because they had loads, lashings of this precious reactive nitrogen. And there was one thing in the garden which made him sad, and it was his pond. In that everything grew really well, and the algae in his pond grew even better. So he used to say, oh, there are definitely fish in there, Dave. But I never saw them. It was always just a pea soup, because there was so much reactive nitrogen being produced from the plant and from him spreading it on his garden that he had, in this case, good productivity, but here nitrogen at the wrong time, the wrong place. It caused eutrophication, algal bloom. And it was this kind of first, obviously I only realised it in retrospect, one of the reasons I got really into nitrogen is that it is this double-edged sword. It can feed us, but if we put it in the wrong place, it can cause problems like eutrophication. There are lots, again, of things I'd like to tell you about nitrogen, but there's one story I think that I really want to tell you. And it's about that reactive nitrogen. If we get more intense rainfall events in it and the fertilizer ends up in our water, it can cause the algal blooms that we just saw. But it can also cause problems in terms of human health. And one of the things, if I take my flask here, I know for a fact, because I got this out of one of the Edinburgh taps, is that it'll have a limited amount of nitrogen in it, of reactive nitrogen. All of our water is carefully controlled so that it doesn't have more than 50 milligrams of nitrate, which is a reactive form of nitrogen, in it. And that's because of human health concerns. So our water companies have to blend the water to make sure it meets those restrictions. That's true across Europe and North America. And the key driver for that is a thing called blue baby syndrome. Now, blue baby syndrome is thankfully quite rare now. You have cases of it, particularly where people are drinking from private wells and often where there's contamination of the wells. But it's where they've consumed too much reactive nitrogen, usually in the form of nitrate, which is why our water's blended. And the most famous example of this, well, it could be even more famous, is from the US, and I would love it to be on TV on the programme House. So if you don't know the programme House, it's a medical drama. It's not on air anymore, but it was Hugh Laurie here was House, the doctor, and he was a great medic, expert, horrible person, but great expert in medicine. And the way the series ran was that they had some really hard case would come in, and him and his team would have to try and crack it, and they would do lots of research, and usually by the end they would come up with the solution, usually House would. Now this real life example was of a case in the US just a few years ago when a woman, not a baby, was rushed into hospital and she was turning blue. And they were getting really worried about her. She was losing consciousness. The doctors weren't sure what to do. You know, blue baby syndrome is normally in babies. But one of them had seen it, a case in babies before, guessed that this was the same thing, but in adults, a very rare thing, gave her the remedy, which is methylene blue, and she started to recover. And then they did the House thing. This is why I think it would be a brilliant House episode. He should come back for a one-off. Is that then they, once she started coming back to consciousness, said, okay, you know, what happened? And she had run, you know, she kind of started to explain what she had been doing that day, and you know, was there anything odd that she had drunk or eaten? They obviously sent the team. House would send his team of junior doctors to her house to check the water. They checked the water. There was no extra nitrate in there. To check her food, nothing, no problem there. It would have been a great episode because she was turning blue at the beginning, but also because there was this mystery. Where had she got massive reactive nitrate poisoning from? And this is where House would have come in. They would have had their board of different causes, and then he would have gone in and gone, okay, we've looked at your house. but take me through the week before you started turning blue. What did you do? And she would have said, well, it's been a normal week. The night before I started to turn blue, I had a hot curry. I remember being thirsty in the night, and I had a big drink of water. But his team had checked the water. The water was fine. They'd checked the curry. Nothing in there. And he said, oh, what about further back in the week? And she said, well, actually, I was running, and I sprained a muscle in my leg, strained a muscle in my leg. And I went to the doctor, and he gave me one of these cold packs to put on it to reduce the swelling, to take away the pain. And that's where House would have gone, right, let's go back to the house. Because when they went back to her house, they had checked the water and they checked the food, but then they looked in the ice box. And in the ice box, they found that cold pack. And so they said to her, you know, when you were thirsty that night and you went downstairs to get a drink, and she said, yeah. They said, did you get any ice? And she said, oh yeah, I put a load of ice in. And they looked at the pack and it had split open. And what she had was a glass of concentrated ammonium nitrate, slugged it back and started turning blue. Wouldn't it be the best House episode? I just really think it should be made. So you heard it here first. So I put that story in just to highlight the fact that in terms of climate smart food, nitrogen, I think, is a key player, a key target for us. I mentioned how important nitrogen use efficiency is. And one of the ways we can increase that efficiency is to understand our soil and the needs of our plants, our crops better. So testing the soil, this is done more and more widely now, and precision agriculture. So we've got this expensive resource, which is nitrogen fertilizer, understanding, do the plants need more nitrogen fertilizer? When do they need it? Instead of putting it on in a way where a lot of it is lost, actually meeting the demands of the plant much better can help push up that nitrogen use efficiency. Looking at different types of fertilizer, which reduce how much is leached into drainage waters or emitted into the air. And again, dietary choice can have a big knock-on effect in terms of that nitrogen use efficiency. Some foods are much more efficient in terms of the transfer of nitrogen to us as consumers. Some are pretty inefficient in terms of the losses to the atmosphere, to the water, to the climate. So on climate smart diets, I thought I would summarise, I guess, some of the key challenges and key areas that could help us become smarter in terms of our diets. So protein source, a really important one. We mentioned that in terms of Daisy's steaks and the methane that's emitted from them. All protein is not the same. Some of it has higher carbon footprints in terms of emission from its production. So again, choices there can help make it climate smarter. Overconsumption is a really big issue, particularly in the West, in terms of too many calories. And obviously there, where we can more optimally consume, then again, you've got a chance to reduce how much production of that food has to be done and the emissions associated with it. So overconsumption, a key target for some Western nations. Nutrition's massive, I think, with this, in terms of meeting what is a massive gap at the moment in terms of global nutrition. So millions of people around the world not getting the right nutrition, and having a climate smart diet which meets those nutritional needs, so avoids the overconsumption and actually provides the amino acids, the micronutrients and the macronutrients that we need as humans in a way which is more sustainable in terms of emissions. That's obviously an ongoing challenge, a huge one, and one that itself is threatened by climate change. Food miles is one hopefully we've all heard of because it's been in the media a lot. And it's one of those things on a research front which is much more complicated than it looks on the outset. So you think, okay, something's come from further away, it's got more food miles, maybe it's come by, come all the way from New Zealand, so it must be worse for the climate. But actually it's more complex than that, as these things always are, in terms of life cycle analyses and whether their production was much more efficient and their emissions much lower. Actually, they can still be better even they're further away. So it's really important to look at what research evidence there is for what's the most climate smart food source. But there are some rules of thumb, like, I guess, these beautiful vegetables here. If we all demand only beautiful vegetables, then there's going to be more waste, and that's going to have a knock-on effect in terms of production emissions for food which is never consumed. And if we expect to eat everything we want all year round and ignore the seasons, then again, obviously there's going to be a production cost in terms of either having to ship food in which we can't grow locally, or try and grow it locally under conditions where we're using lots of heat and light. So that there is definitely an element there in terms of choices we can make in our diet. But the big one for me here, in terms of, I guess, climate smart food, would be waste. It's that area where there's so much potential to help bridge the food gap and address climate change through that ripple effect. If we're cutting food waste, then we have that ripple effect back up the food chain in terms of requiring less production, less fertiliser, less daisies, less emissions. So I think, for me, food waste, this is where a lot of my research is focused, food waste is a real goal for addressing climate smart food. And I'll come back on to some more detail on that in a minute. This, I did say there was one more graph, and this is it. This is a horrible one, because this is one I made. And what it shows is basically that global food loss is very large in its amount. So we obviously have food loss and waste for lots of reasons. But what this analysis did in 2012 was try and quantify how much food of some particular types. We've got milk and we've got chicken, pork, lamb and potatoes are these 5 things here if you can't read it. And on the left, we've got how much food in thousands of tonnes per year is produced, which are the black bars, then wasted are the white bars. And then what we did was calculate, all right, for that wasted food, the food which never meets its kind of destination in terms of being eaten, what's the penalty we pay as a society in terms of emissions of nitrous oxide? And you can see for some foods where we've got food waste globally, but we've got this really big penalty of nitrous oxide emissions which are occurring at the production phase, either for milk or chicken in this case, and that's for food that we don't have a benefit from, that is wasted. And so we've got this penalty for the climate, and it's not helping feed anyone. So addressing even that partially can really help, I think, in terms of mitigation. Okay, so I've talked a lot about the cause, I've talked about some of the solutions. The casualty side of global food production and in terms of agriculture is potentially large, but again, we've got some real solutions. So the kind of things which will affect food production around the world, well, most of the things that we see with climate change are a risk in terms of food production. So things like more intense droughts, heat stress, a really important one for low latitude agriculture, where you've got cereal crops, for instance, which are already near their thermal maxima, how much they can tolerate in terms of summer temperatures. If temperatures rise further, then yields could fall quite dramatically for some of those crop types. There's flooding and erosion risks like we saw with nitrogen, these kind of heavy rainfall events that we can expect to get more intense in Scotland, for instance, in the winter. If we don't manage our soils better and our nitrogen, then we could have negative impacts. Pests and disease, we know that some pests and disease will benefit from the warmer temperatures, the overwintering, and become more of a threat to food production. Ozone is an interesting one, in that we think about ozone as a good thing in the stratosphere, so high up it's protecting us from UV radiation. But we're seeing an increase in ozone concentrations at low levels, and that's often related to higher temperatures, so linked with climate, and pollution of things like nitrogen dioxides. And that can be very damaging to human health, but also to productivity, to plant growth, to our yields. So again, a risk there from higher temperatures. And extreme weather in terms of storm damage to crops and the reduction in yield that can give. And we saw an example of that for the intense drought which affected wheat yield in Russia a few years ago. And one of the key things there was it affected Russia, but it had an effect globally in terms of the global wheat price increased, and it threatened food security globally because of our interconnected food economy around the world. So these knock-on effects can be quite extreme. So that's some of the bad news in terms of climate change. There is some good news in terms of not being a casualty. So one would be, here in Scotland, our growing seasons are extending, and in the first half of the century, we should continue to benefit from longer growing seasons, maybe increased productivity. I think for climate change, even in places like us, so temperate and higher latitudes, into the second half of the century, the negatives start to get bigger and bigger, and certainly globally for food production, we're seeing the bad news story outweighing the good under a business as usual scenario. But there's lots of things, lots of lessons we can learn from how our society, going back 10,000 years and more, has dealt with climate variability or severe weather events and still grown food. This is one of my favourites from Bolivia. So this is a technology called camelones, and it was from pre-Columbian cultures, like it says up here, dating back over 1000 BC. It's not high tech, it's not something that's come out of some fancy lab. It is essentially for a climate where you've got a wet season and a dry season, and climate change may intensify those seasons and threaten your production. So over on the left here, we've got very heavy rain and our crops being flooded and our nutrients being washed away. And then in the dry season, we've got the reverse of that in terms of not enough water to grow our plants. These camelones are canals. They're kind of blank-ended canals, which allow the farmers who use them to, in the wet season, still have emergent soil, still grow their crop, and they have some very happy fish who are swimming up and down. And then in the dry season, when you've got this real pressure in terms of irrigation water, you've got your irrigation, you've retained your nutrients, and you can increase your productivity. Now, it's been done on a relatively small scale. So this project, 400 families supported by Oxfam. But it was very successful in terms of increased productivity and in terms of giving resilience to the extremes of the wet and the dry season. And one of the unexpected benefits they saw, one of the win-wins, was that it gave them more resilience, but because they were producing more food from the camelone areas, there was less pressure on land in the surrounding area to convert it to agriculture to grow more food. So they saw a drop-off in deforestation. So they had that win of increased resilience, but also reduced emissions, in this case from deforestation. So just as an example, because it's one of my favourites, because of the fish, I guess, I think in terms of a win-win, there are some really exciting solutions out there which aren't, high-tech. They're really just looking at indigenous knowledge and employing it. So those climate comrades, I guess camelones would be a climate comrade. Other examples would be agroforestry, so things like these daisies here. These cows are in an environment where they could well suffer heat stress. And certainly in a future climate, the temperatures might get to a stage where their productivity drops, their health drops because of high temperature. But combining their production with trees, which give them shade, can help in terms of carbon sequestration from the trees, but also into the health and well-being of the cattle. So putting trees back into our food production can often be a real benefit. We see this with shade coffee, for instance, as well. Other examples would be push-pull agriculture. So this is an example from East Africa where maize is a staple crop, and one of its biggest pests is stem borer. And stem borer, again, is likely to do well out of climate, just the physical changes. But again, one of the great solutions has been looking at the behaviour of stem borer, using indigenous knowledge, and instead of having just fields of maize, what the farmers have done is implement maize and switchgrass around it, so you kind of have this border of long grass which draws the stem borer away from your maize, so that's the pull. You also have other plants underneath your maize which give off a scent which the stem borers don't like, so that's the push. And the switchgrass itself kills the stem borer. So it's been really successful in increasing yields. Often the co-planting in these systems is with plants, again, that can fix nitrogen. So it's giving the maize extra nitrogen as well and getting rid of the pests. And those kind of integrated agricultural systems can be really, really effective and avoid some of the uses of mass pesticides and herbicides that you might have to use instead. Precision farming I talked about, and this is an example of, I suppose, if I could see, if I was a farmer, exactly what my field needed, then I would know where to put my precious fertilizers. That's the kind of map I'd want to see. So maybe the red is where I need to put water or fertilizer, and the darker areas, maybe they've got enough. And that's how we've got the technology to start moving towards that through remote sensing, through imagery on tractors, to actually get that precision agriculture much better and increase efficiency. But I guess the big comrade that I'm going to come back to and finish off on is food loss and waste. So in terms of the phases of food, of the food supply chain where food is lost around the world, it's really variable, like I said. In the developed world, so in the UK, a lot of our food waste occurs at the consumer stage. So I guess a lot of us, well, try this. Probably when you get to the end of the week, before you go shopping and you open up the fridge, usually, and I have this as well, there's something horrible and rotting at the back of my fridge. And if you multiply that up by all of us, that's a lot of food waste. And often that's through buy one, get one free, and the fact that, you know, things are hidden and you kind of, it's hard to keep up with the food you've got. It's a whole management process. But that's where a lot of our food waste comes in the developed world, and that has a climate price to play in terms of its production. In the developing world, there's a different pattern in terms of a lot of that food wastage and loss happening pre-consumer. So like it says up here, up to 30% is post-harvest loss, but before it gets to the consumer. And with climate change, we've got the increase that gets even higher. That actually the food supply chain in terms of growing our crop in the field and getting it to us as consumers to eat, climate change throws lots of spanners in the works in terms of cutting transport links, destroying storage, making food go off more quickly in terms of spoilage, and in terms of the kind of problem being big already, it could make it even worse. But this is where interventions can give us a major win-win, I think. So one of the things which has been invested very heavily in is storage. Is simply making sure that the grain, in this case, that's been harvested, is more resilient to pests, to vermin, to rainfall and humidity. And so a lot of successful schemes have gone forward on this. Some haven't been as successful. So there's a great literature on it where different storage devices have been provided to subsistence smallholders, particularly in Sub-Saharan Africa. And the people who followed up on the provision, so on these studies, found them being used, you know, as buckets and waste bins a few months later. They weren't being used for storage. And the successful ones took a different approach and spoke to the farmers. They spoke to the users and actually said, what works for you? What works best? One of the key things they found, you can see, is that with this kind of storage, you can imagine how vulnerable it might be to an extreme weather event. One of the major things they found with the farmers is that they needed something where you couldn't tell how much food was inside the storage. Because if your fellow farmers saw how much you got, then they wouldn't be as happy about lending you money and things like that. So there was a key understanding of the social science was needed in human behaviour to make these interventions successful. But there have been some successful interventions on storage. Similarly, for things like the bags, again, a huge amount of good research has gone on in terms of different communities, what kind of storage bags are going to be reused for you, what is going to work for you. And I had to include Emily here. So Emily Cummings is, she's a hero of mine. And she's a hero because she is, I think, a great inventor, and that she used her gap year probably in the most inspiring way I can think of, in that she had a gap year in Sub-Saharan Africa, and one of the things she noticed was that there was enough food, but the food went off very quickly. There was no mains electricity in some of the villages she visited, and she saw that it was food storage was the main issue. There was no refrigeration. Now, the backstory to Emily is that she drove her grandfather mad, apparently. So when she was a wee girl, she would help him in the workshop, probably, you know, breaking his tools and making things. But when she saw this problem on her gap year and came back, she had the confidence to think, well, I'll design something. And so she made this, which is a solar fridge. So it's very simple in terms of it doesn't need mains power. It works by putting a liquid in the outside layer, and evaporative cooling cools whatever's inside. And she's a hero to me because she's an example of solutions, of the innovation that can come through the brilliance that is humans when faced with that kind of challenge, coming up with what isn't a high-tech solution, but one that actually is effective. Other areas of food, the food supply chain that we can intervene on potentially to increase the speed of the food getting to the people who need it, reducing the waste. So things like those transport links from a policy point of view, looking at the climate change vulnerability and putting in better protection. Mobile phone technology has been fantastic in terms of farmers around the world knowing where to take their food to get the right price, making sure the market's not already flooded with the stuff they've got so it goes to waste. So technology does have a major part to play in terms of addressing this side, I think. So I've talked quite a bit there about the Sub-Saharan Africa example. I wanted to put up a few numbers just to, I suppose, underline what the potential is in that area. So $4 billion worth of avoidable losses in terms of this food lost post-harvest. It's equivalent to all of the cereal imports for Sub-Saharan Africa, so a huge amount lost in this post-harvest phase. And it could feed 48 million people. So again, if the interventions can reduce that food loss and waste just a bit, the ripple effects up the food supply chain could be very positive indeed. So I'm going to stop there with my key targets, and these are my personal targets, I guess. If I had to, I think food, climate smart food is really exciting. As a researcher, you know, there's endless interesting papers and things on cow hotels that you can look at. But I think in terms of positive interventions, the precision agriculture is really important, from nitrogen use efficiency, from getting our crops growing as best as they can do and making sure that technology and that expertise spreads beyond just the kind of richest countries. I think dietary choice is a key target in terms of our understanding of what is climate smart food, having alternatives and good education about what's good for us, what is going to meet our nutritional needs, what is going to be lower impact in terms of climate. And then, yeah, the ultimate one for me, one that's just got such huge potential and where interventions can have such an effect, is on food loss and waste. Thank you all.
I don't think you mentioned an important issue in terms of diet choice, which is, of course, that ruminants can eat grass and we can't. And there's a lot of the world where you can only grow grass. But the trouble is, when ruminant animals eat high forage diets, they produce more methane. So how do you resolve that one?
The simple way, I guess the relatively simple way I would avoid it is in terms of ruminants in our diet, and that's particularly in the case of our beef that we had up there, is to reduce consumption of that and look at protein sources which are like microproteins and insect protein, which have a lower methane emission. Saying that, and your colleagues at SAC have led some of this research, is that not all cows are equal. And so one of the really nice studies which came out, I think earlier this year, so this was Dominic Moran, who's one of your colleagues, he was looking at different types of livestock agriculture in the world, and they were particularly looking at a system in South America where the livestock themselves actually promote carbon sequestration in the soil. So the more intensive they get, up to a point, you actually increase the carbon stocks. And it was a modelling exercise, but it was a really nice point that actually when you're looking at what is climate smart food, in their context, under certain management conditions, having more cows was a net benefit in terms of reducing the emissions of the food production. So as a bit like the food miles, there are really interesting complexities, but as a general rule of thumb, things like ruminant meat tend to have a higher carbon footprint than other sources of protein, but it's not an absolute rule.
Do you have an opinion on urban farming and how that might play its role in climate change and mitigation?
Do I have an opinion on it? Yes. I guess in terms of the best examples I've seen of urban farming locally have been much more about education. So they've been about my kids, for instance, but I guess the community understanding more about where their food comes from. And so they've provided fantastic days out, and they've meant that my kids, when we go home, understand more about what's on their plates. So in that role, I think, hugely important. The other form of urban farming that I haven't seen so much of, but I've seen programs on it and the internet, and people have told me about it, is commercial farming in an urban environment. So things like aquaculture, things like large-scale greenhouse production in the urban environment, and making use of things like waste heat for heating greenhouses, for aquaculture, using the benefits of the urban heat island effect and the fact that your market's kind of on your doorstep, literally, so you can get a more efficient system that way. So all I've heard about it so far are positive stories, and certainly my only first-hand experience, which is our local farms here, has been really, really good. But beyond that, I guess where you could see urban farming going is, instead of it being at the moment quite a niche thing in terms of our food supply, is it becoming more of a significant part. So instead of our cities and urbanisation, as we know, is an ongoing trend, instead of them being massive draws of resources into the city, actually the city providing some of its own food. Always space and efficiency is going to be key to that. But yeah, some of the examples I've seen are very encouraging.
On a personal level, do you have any advice for us on how we might identify climate smart foods, and also how we might minimise our personal food waste?
Good. So yeah, what's a climate smart food? I think my rule of thumb, I suppose, in terms of, on a personal level, trying to have a climate smarter diet, I've radically reduced my meat intake. So I'm still eating some meat, but that's been one of the things I know tends to have a higher carbon footprint, and processed meat particularly, because it's got such bad health impacts if you have too much processed meat. That's something we've banned. And my youngest was really cross about that because she loves bacon and there is no bacon allowed anymore. So she'll probably have counselling later on, therapy about that when she's grown up. I think in terms of our labelling of food, it doesn't usually tell us about it, whether it's climate smart or not. So that kind of puts the emphasis on us to try and do some research in terms of what the climate benefits or disbenefits might be, but the meat rule of thumb would be the main one. I think in terms of overall, it's that food waste. The key tips for that, they're hackneyed, and it feels they've been pushed out by governments quite a lot. There's a brilliant organisation called WRAP in the UK, and Scotland has a kind of arm of WRAP, and that's WRAP. They're superb in terms of, I think, the information they give you, but advice. And their key advice for avoiding food waste would be to make a list when you go to the shops, so that even though they have those seductive smells of cooking bread and donuts and things like that, that you stick to your list, so you don't have this impulse buying that ends up with then more food than you can eat. The other things they recommend are paying pretty careful attention to your portion sizes. So a lot of the wastage in their surveys is through they have a component going off in the fridge, but they also have a lot of food which is left on plates. And we all know this, if as parents or when we were kids, there were things we didn't like eating. And that can add up into large amounts of wastage, particularly if you have large portion sizes where things are thrown away. So they had simple advice like smaller plates, looking at the labels on your food on a regular basis. And for me, it's definitely having a fridge where I can see the back of it more, so things don't hide away and start decomposing before I can get there to eat them. But yeah, look up the WRAP website. I think they're a really good resource.
You haven't mentioned anything about the oceans and fishing and where that fits in with all of this. Yeah. And the second thing is, how do we balance all of this with animal welfare standards as well? Because some of the more, I suppose, modern and intense farming methods, which may be seen as a solution to this, actually have appalling welfare standards for animals. So what have you got to say about that?
Yeah, so on the oceans and aquaculture, more generally, I guess, that's already a major source, going back to protein sources, but also food source through macroalgae too. Already really important, and it's growing fast. The data on it, so we've just been doing some work on this, so it's a really nice question for me to get, is really scant in terms of what's the emissions from aquaculture. It's poorly quantified. So our estimates are that it's still a minor component of the global food system in terms of emissions, around about 4%, but that it will grow quite rapidly over the coming decades because of our increased use of aquaculture and obviously of fish stocks, but aquaculture becoming more important as they decline. In terms of the carbon footprint as a source of protein, though, some aquaculture methods are amazingly efficient and really low emission. So things like mussels and oysters, they have really low carbon footprints as a source of food. There's this example of grass carp in China, where this system goes back thousands of years, but you have your pigs, and the waste from the pigs goes into your pond, and it helps grow the plants in your pond, and the grass carp eat the grass or the weeds that are growing, and then you eat your carp. And that's a really efficient system when it comes down to nitrogen and the kind of resource cycling that you see. So one of the issues there is how acceptable to all of us is a nice carp steak rather than a beef steak. And carp, they kind of taste a bit muddy, I think. And it's one of those things where, you know, if I had a lovely steak like I showed earlier, or a carp steak, it would be hard for me to pick the carp steak every time. But they are very efficient. In terms of animal welfare, I think obviously it's a crucial thing in terms of the intensification and the increased demand for food we've got and this change in diet. I guess in terms of climate change, and I alluded to it a bit in there, one of the threats we've got with a lot of our intensive agriculture is climate change itself, particularly high temperature, but severe weather events when you've got lots of animals together and where you've got maybe limited ventilation or you're having to spend more money on ventilation because of a heat wave, then there's a massive animal welfare risk there, which on pure economic terms, our agricultural system has to get better, more resilient to current climate, but also future climates, because otherwise you've got that huge animal welfare problem, which has a knock-on, if we go just in terms of their production and their cost benefit, they're going to lose money if they don't protect their animals better and treat them better and protect them from things like heat stress. So I think a climate-smart food system is one where animal welfare is absolutely part of it, rather than just as an added extra.
I was wondering, on the diet change bit, what your opinion is on the current trends in both developing and the developed worlds, and on that, what the role of institutions should be in promoting this change of, let's say, governments, think tanks, charities.
Yeah, so what's the trend is broadly towards a diet which is more meat intensive as affluence increases. But you see some stark regional variations. So Japan is a good example where you've got high incomes, but the meat intake is actually still relatively low compared to us. And actually there's much more reliance on fish and aquaculture, which itself has a lower carbon footprint in our analysis, but then you have issues about the sustainability of the fish stocks and where that fish protein is coming from. I suppose some of the key trends which we're seeing, so India is a good example, where you've got some increase in affluence. You've got actually a large number of people lifted out of what we would class as poverty on a global level. But nutrition standards don't seem to be keeping pace with that. There seems to be a failure there in terms of more affluence, but still widespread malnutrition. And a lot of that is about how we measure our food system and how we measure enough. So enough calories doesn't necessarily translate into enough nutrition. And I think that's a trend that we're potentially going to see even more in some countries, where we're kind of ticking the box on calories, but we're not looking at where those calories are coming from and is it nutritionally the right mix. And climate change, I didn't mention it in my talk because I wanted to keep it relatively brief. One of the other things that we get, the cause of climate change, one of the main drivers, is more carbon dioxide. And what more carbon dioxide is doing right now is making plants grow better. It makes lots of plants grow better. Cereals are an example, and you could say, well, that's great. For food security, we get more yields. But if you look at how the plants react to more CO2 and how much they grow, the nutritional value often of the cereal and of the food you get is reduced. And so you're getting more calories, you're getting more output, but actually one of the key things that matters to us as a human in terms of, you know, our kids growing to the full height and not being malnourished is not just calories, it's the quality of the food. So I think that's a key area for work and for attention. The other one that I find really exciting, although Leslie doesn't like the look of them, is insects and alternative sources of protein. So we've seen a lot around mycoproteins like corn. We've seen some increase in terms of insects have been consumed as a normal part of the diet in many areas of the world and still are at the moment. But we've seen these foods coming in at the moment still as a quite exotic thing, something like I think there's a shop in Edinburgh which is now selling insect food. And the reports I've heard are that you know, it's one of those things you go in and do once as a dare, but I don't think there's mass insect consumption happening yet. But it could well happen in terms of our barriers to this, maybe our disgust at eating insects. If as we progress, like if you had given me sushi in the 1980s, I would have treated it a bit like you and the insects, Leslie. Whereas if you give me sushi today, raw fish, I'll lap it up. And so I think, again, the social science is crucial to this. Understanding human behaviour, understanding our levers, where we've got a really viable source, a better source, say, for protein, which will give us more sustainable production and meet nutrition needs, then we need to understand the users more, and maybe 10 years down the line, this will be our normal lunch. So like at the moment, you get these little boxes of sushi. Instead, it will be a little box of insects to keep you going through the afternoon.
Delicious. I imagine if you put it in haggis and nobody would notice.
For us in Scotland, what is the kind of one policy that we should be pushing the government to implement, in your opinion, to create a climate smart food system?
In Scotland, it's easy for me, but I'm biased. It's nitrogen use efficiency. So it's that issue I talked about in terms of that valuable resource, reactive nitrogen, that we put on our fields in Scotland. It helps our crops grow better, but our efficiency in terms of its use is around that 30%. And where government can really help us in terms of the farming community is to incentivise more efficient nitrogen use production. That applies to livestock as well in terms of nitrogen storage in the form of manure, but better incentivisation of good nitrogen management. If we had that, and that includes extension services to farmers, so support from from SAC, for instance, would be a key deliverer of that. That would have a major impact for Scotland-wide agriculture. So nitrogen use efficiency would be mine.
Thank you. Right, so we are good about...
In terms of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, it put ecosystem damage quite high because of nutrients, because of nitrogen, basically. So we've seen that already changing our world. So in terms of that, should we put a price on nitrogen? Should there be an economic reason not to waste it, as we are seeing so much of?
Yes, in terms of the externalities of nitrogen aren't represented in its price. So a bit like carbon, they aren't represented. So yes, is my quick answer, is put the externalities on the price of nitrogen.
I've just recently been hearing loads about how a lot of the food given to livestock is based on soya, which is obviously involves a lot of deforestation and destruction of carbon sinks. And I just wondered if there's any work being done on making the food that we feed the livestock more climate smart.
Yes, there is the answer, and that alludes to my previous answer in terms of livestock agriculture. Is a whole range in terms of its efficiency and its climate forcing. One of the things I didn't mention very quickly is another option that is a bit space age, but it is artificial meat. I don't know if you heard about that. So we had our first artificial burger last year, made in a lab, synthetic protein. So that could be another way, if the costs radically come down and the energy inputs, that could be another source where you don't even have to feed a cow, it's just grown in the lab.
Could you please explain the graph where the waste and loss emissions from poultry are higher than the ones from milk? And for example, does the milk emissions also include the production of cheese?
I'll quickly try and do it. So, where are we? This one. So to quickly explain again, the black bars are how much we waste globally in units of kilotons, so thousands of tons. For milk and for poultry, we've got the white bar, which is the wastage globally. And then this hatched bar are the emissions of nitrous oxide. So this is specific to nitrous oxide, doesn't include methane. And this is specific to the production of that food. So it doesn't matter kind of what it was intended for, if it was intended for cheese or for us to drink, if it's the milk. It was intended for human consumption, but it was wasted. And that was the nitrous oxide which was emitted during its production.
For us to be as smart as possible in future, do you think the future is to be organic? And I suppose mainly with reference to milk and beef production.
No, I think organic agriculture gives us some really good lessons in terms of how you can be more sustainable in your food production. There are some good examples of where organic farming gives you lower emission from production, but actually there are other examples where the organic agriculture didn't, on a per kilogram of steak or per litre of milk, it didn't do as well as the conventional agriculture in terms of that production efficiency and emissions. And I guess, obviously, I've focused on climate smart food, pretty specifically in terms of reducing emissions, and I haven't considered very much here about other aspects of farming in terms of things like welfare, which were brought up, but also herbicide, pesticide use, where organic agriculture gives you other co-benefits. So I'm very much, and this is my fault, focused on emissions and climate change, and part of any good analysis would look at the costs and benefits across the piece. So organic agriculture definitely has a part to play, really good lessons, but I think in terms of feeding 9 billion people, we need all the good tools in the toolbox and to utilise them. And sometimes that's going to mean artificial fertilisers, pesticides, herbicides. So it really is having a blanket rule book is not the way, I think, to get the successes we want. The sound's gone.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. We have run out of time, unfortunately. Just before we finish, I want to plug next week's Enlightenment Lecture, which is by Quentin Cooper on science and science communication, about public engagement in science. So it's same place, same time, same venue. So please come along to that. Can I thank you all for coming this evening? Thank you very much to the organisers of this really important series, really important today, particularly today, I think, in the light of last week's elections. And thank you for your excellent questions. And Dave, thank you for your effortlessly erudite and eloquent lecturing. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.